The Vietnam War and the push for US involvement was a result of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. A lie. The Iraq War famously is a result of lies. Wars in Somalia are a result of lies. The Second World War and the German invasion of Poland was a result of carefully constructed lies. That is war by media. Let us ask ourselves, of the complicit media, which is the majority of the mainstream press, what is the average death count attributed to each journalist?
That was Julian Assange at the very top at an anti-war speech in 2010 in London. And of course, Anton Karas from The Third Man, the theme song. I'm Randy Credico. This is Randy Credico live on the fly with a special Assange Countdown to Freedom, which will be played on various channels and websites and radio stations. So we're not going to identify them right here, except for to say we have a very special show today as we go into the holidays. This is actually being recorded on the anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which I just now realized. But we have, and we're going to have ladies first. We have, we're introducing wise Colleen Rowley, who's been on this show several times. She is a whistleblower, former FBI special agent and counsel, and she's a recipient of the prestigious Sam Adams Award. John Kiriakou, whose books, he's written about 10 books, also a whistleblower, a recipient. I think Craig Murray gave him the award in 2016, the Sam Adams Award. And John is going off to Germany to present a book about whistleblowers. And certainly last but not least, someone that we all admire and respect. And you know, Daniel Ellsberg has been so gracious and so generous with his time. But there was a 5-year lapse where I was afraid to ask him, because I know how busy he is, to do this show. I've done about 200 Assange shows, but he's joining us again from Berkeley, California. And John, let's start off, because we're kind of free forming this.
You bet.
How important is Daniel Ellsberg in this movement to free Assange?
I don't want to embarrass Dan, of course, but I'll repeat what I've said publicly. Dan is the godfather of modern day national security whistleblowing. If Dan hadn't done what he did with the Pentagon Papers, none of us would have been able to do what we did later. And the parallels between what Dan did so long ago now, 50 years ago, and what Julian did are striking. Listen, Julian's a smart guy. Julian knows history. He's studied history. He knew about Dan and Dan's heroic actions by releasing the Pentagon Papers. I know that Dan was a source of inspiration for Julian, just like he was a source of inspiration for all the rest of us. I'm honored to know him. You know, I still name drop Dan with my friends. Like, I know Dan Ellsberg, and I consider him to be a friend. You know, I still can't believe that I'm friends with Dan Ellsberg. It means so much to me, and people people understand that. They realize that because now they have a real appreciation for what he did. Dan knew what the consequences were, and he did it anyway because it was the right thing to do. And that has inspired so many more people to do the right thing, the least of which is certainly not Julian Assange.
Colleen as well. You've known Dan, says you guys are friends. Has he been an inspiration to a lot of people, including yourself?
Well, yes, of course. The one thing that I find very unusual, and sadly unusual, about Daniel Ellsberg is he's a survivor. You know, whistleblowing is such a traumatic and risky and in some ways soul, wrenching situation, especially if you lose even your own family and friends, etc. That, he's one of the very few who not only survived that experience and actually was able to turn it into something good and use it, but also he's the Duracell battery.
Yeah.
And he's never looked back, and it's just been straightforward. I think Julian Assange, it's so difficult for him now in prison this way. But I think he has similar strength of character as Daniel Ellsberg. And maybe, we could even say people like Mandela, who actually did go through that kind of a prison experience and were able to come out of it. So, we have to cross our fingers right now, but obviously this is what we're aiming for. We're aiming for surviving, truth-telling, and then continuing on. And it's never been so difficult as it is in the present time.
Well, Dan, let me ask you this. You've inspired so many whistleblowers, Ed Snowden, John, Colleen, Julian. Who inspired you when you went forward? I know there was an anti-war activist who has the same name, Randy Keller, I believe, that inspired you to go forward. But what prior to that was it that subconsciously drove you to actually do it?
Well, listen, let me back off there for one moment, because I didn't expect, and it's not clear to me why we're starting this off with such gratifying praise from my friends here. But the funny thing is, as I'm looking at this screen, I'm looking at two people that I was talking about this morning. I had a 2-hour Zoom meeting with a class at UMass Amherst run by Professor Chris Appy. And in the course of that, I had time enough to talk about heroes of mine here, but in two contexts. One, that the example that the question arises as to when you should not only be a whistleblower, but when it is simply wrong to prosecute a whistleblower. The most obvious case would be when you're revealing criminality, and the idea that you can be prosecuted Colleen is the lawyer here, but the idea that you can be prosecuted for revealing crime by the government is something deeply wrong with that system. Well, I would say nothing in the world, pretty much, is as illegal, as criminal, as torture. As I understand it, it's known as jus cogens, which is supposedly non-derogable criminality, in the sense that no parliament, no executive branch, no court can make it legal. It's like piracy or a few other things that are odd historic things that come in there, but torture cannot be made legal. And then you can argue about what is torture, but then there's lots of things that are really beyond argument, and that's what the U.S. was doing in this case. And I said, how many people, hundreds at least, 1,000 more, John would know better, were aware that what we were doing was criminal, not only in international law, but in our Constitution and in domestic law, and that there was no way to make it legal. And of all the hundreds of people who knew that we were doing that, one, to my knowledge, went to prison. And that was the one who revealed, inadvertently or otherwise, revealed the name of a torturer, a covert actor As I understand it, he was not aware that the person's status at that time was still protected. But anyway, he was charged with doing that and went to prison, having in fact revealed somebody in the torture program and having earlier described the waterboarding as torture, for which I think the CIA will never forgive him, as he probably says.
No.
Just as they will never forgive Snowden, they will never forgive Chelsea Manning for revealing that we were turning people over to torture in Iraq under Obama, knowing it was for torture, which is as illegal as doing the torture ourselves. And so she spent 7.5 years in prison. So anyway, I was describing John in those terms as having been dealt with very badly by his country and by his former agency, but in general, constitutionally, by the president, by everybody, and in a way that should not happen in this country. But I was also mentioning Colleen, as who is, I said, the word whistleblower was pretty much legitimized for the first time by a Time cover with Persons of the Year. That was not me. Whistleblowers, Colleen Rowley's face on that cover. And
Right here.
Yeah, oh, really? Okay. Well, just between us, not to derogate or anyway, the two other women who were there, very technically, as I read their account for Enron, I think, another one, I'm not sure I would call them whistleblowers. They were truth tellers, but correct me if I'm wrong, Colleen. My understanding is that they told the truth to their bosses and not to outside the agency, the corporation, which about which was giving incriminating information. Again, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think the other two, who acted admirably within their organization, did not take the step of risking their careers, being ostracized, being possibly even prosecuted, by going outside that organization to hold it accountably. And Colleen did do that. And as I understand it, not to go into it too much, I think she experienced the kind of, not entirely, but ostracism within her own organization, the FBI, that every truth teller who is revealing wrongdoing by her or his own group is risking ostracism, and most people will not take that risk. So again, as I say, I'm looking at two people who very much do exemplify, I would say, the best in America, the possibility of American citizenship, which is too little observed.
John, do you want to say something?
Thank you for that, Dan. That means a lot to me. You know, one of the things that Dan taught me early on was that there's a greater good. There's a greater good with whistleblowing. One of the things that I learned from a recent study on whistleblowers is that whistleblowers have a much more highly defined sense of right and wrong than the general population. This is something borne out in psychological studies. And so when a whistleblower is considering blowing the whistle on waste, fraud, abuse, or illegality, or threats to the public health or public safety, he or she takes into consideration that greater good. And you know, eventually history is going to catch up with the issue and with everybody else. You may be vilified the way Dan was vilified, the way Julian Assange is being vilified right now. But eventually, the rest of the world will catch up. We've seen this happen throughout history. And I think that's one of the reasons why Julian has been so steadfast in his belief that he did the right thing. God knows the cost has been high. We see what the poor man is undergoing. Nils Melzer has said repeatedly, Nils Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, has said repeatedly that what Julian has been experiencing is a form of torture. We all know that the way the United States practices solitary confinement is a form of torture. We know that these CMUs, these communications management units that we have in our medium and maximum security prisons, is a form of torture. But the government doesn't yet have an appreciation for the fact that none of that matters. Julian is tougher than everybody gives him credit for being, just like Dan was tougher than everybody gave him credit for being. You know, Dan stood up to a president, arguably one of the most powerful and corrupt presidents in modern American history. Julian has stood up to what, 3 different presidents so far. So there's this odd way that people have a tendency to underestimate our resolve. And they do that, I think, Randy, at their own peril.
Colleen, jump in there. I'm a fly on the wall on this one.
Well, I think in any whistleblower's trajectory, if you want to call it that, from start to finish, a lot of times it begins with a certain amount of naivety, where people are honestly believe so much in that there is right and wrong, and that it's really hard to believe that you can be in these situations like Orwell. I think Orwell has a quote where you become a traitor telling the truth in an empire of lies. And I mean, that's really, really, I think, a telling thing right now, the empire of lies, and you're a traitor to tell the truth. But, it's hard to think that at the start. You don't think that just outing torture, for heaven's sakes, everybody would think, okay, if you're torturing, that's right, very wrong. And you can't believe that you can be the one that's later smeared for being the one who told the truth about torture or other war crimes. It's hard to believe that. I know we're going to talk a little bit about the Assange case and a little bit about the FBI's informant
Yes,
program.
we're going to do that in the second half here.
But
Yes.
I'm just going to jump a little bit ahead, because one of the things that, as the trajectory goes on, long before 9/11 and all of this started, long before that, after a lot of years in the FBI, I started to see, oh my gosh, look what they're doing with these informants. They're operating murderers in some cases. And again, you think, okay, everybody's going to want to stop this. As soon as we know that the FBI is operating murderers, that will end, because nobody will be for that. And that's where, again, this kind of this trajectory, the scales come off your eyes. And that's a real sad experience, to find out that people are so easily misled on knowing right from wrong. Going back to what you said, it's really a depressing thing to see how many other people can't stick to principles and can't stick to what's right and what's wrong in really horrible situations like an empire of lies, which is Orwell's term, but I think it's very fitting.
Yes. We're talking with Colleen Riley, John Kiriakou, and Mr. Daniel Ellsberg. Dan, I always say call you Dan. Dan, I'm going to ask everybody a stupid question. I'll start with you, Dan. Does anybody have any regrets for coming forward, Dan?
I haven't met a whistleblower, and I've sought out many of them, including both of you. I've sought them out because I identify with them so much, and I know what they've gone through. I've been through that same trajectory, which, remember, always is for us a trajectory, because we got access to that information by having been loyal servants of the cause of the organization up till then, or we wouldn't have gotten that access. And so then, as Colleen says, the scales fall from your eyes at some point. They fall from a lot more eyes than those people who know who actually speak out. Because it's one thing not to know it, as I've learned, and we've all seen in the last year especially, anyone can believe anything. And anyone can deny anything, practically. I mean, look at what we're seeing in the country. It's rather staggering to some extent. But we all started out believing, and a number of other people with us, I'm sure, at least in the cases I know, Snowden, for example, know that other colleagues knew just as much, just as well as Snowden's colleagues said, this is wrong. You know, we're listening to everyone, everything, and this is wrong. But what would they do about it? And as is always the case, I have children in college. I have a mortgage on my house. We're all settled here in this community. I just can't afford to break with all of that. And that's understandable to a large extent. And the price generally is high. I am one of the few, as I think Colleen referred to, lucky one, but I am one of the few who in effect got away with it by virtually a miracle of a convergence of circumstances that led to revelation of criminality by the president, which actually led to dismissal of my case. But very unusual. Nixon wanted to put me in prison for 115 years, but didn't get it. Assange is facing 175 years, which would come to much the same thing if they got us in. But he is in prison now, being held at this point. Snowden, permanent exile. John was 30 months, something like that, in prison. Huh? And Chelsea Manning, 7.5 years. Daniel Hale right now.
45 months.
Ritter, is that it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was referring to him this morning to these students. The students today don't know his predecessor. It's amazing enough. If you know, his predecessor was Nathan Hale. And
Yes.
It turned out I asked for how many people in that class knew the name. I grew up with it, of course, and they don't. But I think of myself, or I have said, this was Daniel Hale's actual ancestor. And he was the first person prosecuted for giving information to Americans, true information. I'm the second, it turns out. I am proud of that heritage here. He was hanged by the British for being a spy for Washington and for a country that didn't actually yet exist in a recognized form. What he was famous for, as you and we know, saying as he was about to be hanged, I regret that I have but one life to give for my country. And what country was that? Colin was saying it was a country founded by traitors like Nathan Hale and Washington and every signer of the Declaration of Independence, who were all liable, like Nathan Hale, to be hanged as traitors, and several of them were traitors to George III, of whom they had been loyal subjects just 2 years earlier or 3 years earlier. And they found a new loyalty to a country that, let's put it this way, that doesn't have an official Secrets Act officially, that doesn't make a traitor of someone who criticizes the leader, the monarch, the government. That's our country, supposedly. So it would be good if they know this history more. You asked me, Randy, who inspired me, and I was thinking as I heard these wonderful tributes when John was saying we are inspired by. I was looking and said, I've never heard from Colleen that she had me in mind, and I don't know it yet exactly either. I was told by a biographer of Julian that he had been inspired by me. And I said, how could that be? I happen to know when he was born, it was when he was born, a week after my wife and I had spent 13 days eluding the FBI. Successfully, by the way. I don't know how you feel about that, Colleen, about your old organization, but at one point, having eluded them for 13 days, I asked my lawyer, Leonard Boudin, what is the FBI actually good at? And he said, taking surrenders, which I did after 13 days. But the point was that Julian had been born just after that, so how could I have inspired him? And the biographer said his mother was an anti-Vietnam War activist in Australia. And she, in Australia, had told him stories of the anti-war movement in this country. including my name. So that was very gratifying to hear that it had been like that. In my case, there was, in addition to Randy Kaler, who was, as I've often told the story, announced that he was going to prison, and that struck me very, very hard because I hadn't known he was on his way to prison. But and confronted me with the question, all right, what can I do to help end this war now that I'm ready to go to prison like him? But just 2 days earlier, another young man named Bob Eaton was being sentenced for draft resistance, draft resistance, and I had stood in a vigil line at this conference. And I think John and Colleen will appreciate, at that conference of the War Resisters League, I was reluctant to go to that vigil because I was still working at RAND, and I thought, if my picture is in front of the Philadelphia courthouse here, standing in a line, it not only people will think I've gone mad, they will think, what? A man who had access to these higher ups, and could give them advice, and access is, what could be less dignified than standing on a hot afternoon in front of the courthouse handing out leaflets? But the change that made in my life was, well, I was about to say, I didn't really want to go to that. But I thought of saying that I was sick or something. And then I thought, well, the conference is still going on. They'll see that I'm not sick. So I had to go. And then I found in the course of it that I wasn't made of sugar after all. I wasn't dissolving at this indignity. And I started handing out leaflets to people in the court. And that actually changed my life. That was before Randy, in a way, because it was like when you step over a line in the recruiting office, and that in the Marines, as I had done, you step over the line, and for the rest of your career, you're told, you stepped over that line, don't complain, don't, whatever happens, you volunteered. Well, in standing in a vigil for Bob Eaton, I was stepping over a line. I was joining a movement actively. And that was a critical moment. Before that, I had been reading for the last year or two because of a young woman that I met who was a Gandhian and had introduced me to works of Gandhi, Barbara Deming, Revolution and Equilibrium, Joan Bondurant, Conquest of Violence and Analysis of Gandhian work, and in particular, Martin Luther King's Stride Toward Freedom, in particular, where he tells about how he, with some misgivings, joined the boycott in connection with buses, in connection with Rosa Parks. And why was he reluctant? Because boycott was something used by the white citizens' councils, and to boycott anybody who integrated, who allowed blacks to be in the restaurant. He said, can I use the same tactic here? The thing. And then he thought, he remembered what Gandhi had said and others, that to be silent in the face of evil was to participate in it. And that he had to put his body on the line there and tell the truth, even when it did lead to great ostracism. And by the way, when he came out against the war in 1967, a year before he was killed, or a year to the day before he was killed, sorry. Let me turn that out, it's my wife. He was ostracized. Almost every paper in the country denounced him for having hurt his standing with the civil rights movement by taking on this controversial subject. But as he said, I feel an obligation to do it. He said, there comes a time when silence is culpability, complicity. And
okay, we have to take a quick break here. Dan, we have to take a quick break here. And for those listening in New York City, you can hear all of this on Assange Countdown to Freedom or next Monday on a different network. We'll be right back after a quick musical break. Okay, I'm Randy Credico live on the fly here, here on the Progressive Radio Network and on Assange Countdown to Freedom, speaking to three very special individuals: John Kiriakou, former CIA agent turned whistleblower; Colleen Rowley, former FBI special agent turned whistleblower, truth teller; and of course, what can you say? Daniel Ellsberg, the great Daniel Ellsberg. We are talking, we're going to continue talking about now the Assange case. And by the way, I want to ask you this, Colleen. When Dan was around, and maybe he'll get to this as well, there was a lot more support for Daniel Ellsberg when he came out. And by the way, Julian's birthday is July 3rd, 1971. His mother is Christine Assange. She's been on the show 3 or 4 times as well. And she was an anti-war demonstrator. But let me ask you, Colleen, why is it that Julian doesn't have the massive support that Daniel Ellsberg had back in 1971 in this country?
I've actually written an article about this. And even though that was written 5 or 6 years ago, it's entitled "Recipe Concocted for Perpetual War." And I could not get it published in a mainstream paper. I sent it to 15 different papers. And eventually I put it on, or it got put on Consortium News. And the difference between, and I tried to explain the difference between the Vietnam War and the current post 9/11 wars, perpetual wars, and how the ruling elite came up with a recipe that makes it nearly impossible for anyone to oppose it in the United States. Obviously, people around the world oppose US wars, but here in the United States, we have very little of the peace movement that grew during Vietnam. So in Vietnam, it was just the opposite. There was very low opposition initially, but then the opposition grew. And then it really grew after the Pentagon Papers. Look at what's happened here after the post 9/11 wars, even with the Afghan papers being published, which were very, very telling. And before that, with the WikiLeaks documents being published, essentially support for war, maybe little differences in what places to drop the bombs on. Now we want to go to war with Russia and China. And, you know, we're tired of Afghanistan, Iraq, the Middle East, but now we've switched to even bigger prize. But you never see on the mainstream news, you don't see anything like the Cronkite moment where somebody says, even after the really bad ending of the Afghanistan war, there should have been a Cronkite moment. Mm-hmm. There should have been a time where people said, this is very stupid. What the heck are we doing? Let's look at this and never do it again. Well, I'm in a group with Danny Shorson and some veterans that try to do this. But again, we can't even get published. Or if we do get published, it just doesn't even make a difference. So I think it is the fact that they came up with this recipe for perpetual war, and it's really hard to dislodge this. And of course, now it's really hard to be a whistleblower because it's unlike even during Vietnam where there was a peace movement. What do we have left now? We have a handful of people in church basements singing Kumbaya. There's hardly anyone who really is against war. And the media, the mainstream media, sold out, bought out, you know, whatever. Even progressive, I hate to say this, but even some progressive things, they go for humanitarian war. As long as you can say it's for human rights and democracy, they're all for it too. And again, I'm very cynical about this fact right now that we fell for this recipe for perpetual war. And here in the United States, it's just very difficult to be a whistleblower.
John?
Yeah.
John, let me ask you, you know, way back 10 years ago, you came out, there wasn't a massive movement in support of John Kiriakou as well. So, I mean, is there a feeling of loneliness, isolation and hopelessness?
I would defy you to name one whistleblower who hasn't considered suicide in his or her darkest days after going public, and realizing just how little public support there is out there. Oh yeah. And it's funny too, because after I made my revelations, I got so many death threats that I actually had to leave the country for a couple of weeks. My wife and I took our kids to Mexico. Just, the FBI recommended that we go on vacation somewhere, that at least 2 of these threats were credible, and we should just make ourselves scarce. And then I got an email from a retired deputy director of the CIA saying, and I'll never forget it, I saved it. He said, "You've chosen a difficult road, but I'm glad somebody did. I just wish I had had the courage to do it myself."
Wow.
That translated into nothing for me. No support at all, no public support. I was ostracized by my CIA colleagues. Even if they were whispering very quietly among themselves that I had done the right thing. But Randy, when the media is controlled by the big corporations, where the big newspapers don't have an investigative reporting budget anymore, so they rely on press releases and friendly relations with the CIA's Office of Public Affairs or the FBI's Office of Public Affairs, and they just gist whatever those offices give them, a whistleblower doesn't have a chance. You don't have a chance because you don't have the same kind of access to this corporate media that the rest of them do. You're on your own.
Dan, so going back to 71, I know you went to William Fulbright, and you went to another senator back then,
Matthias.
George McGovern.
McGovern and Matthias also.
And then Mike Gravel finally registered up on the Senate floor.
Yes.
But was it a lonely experience for you at that point in time? Did you feel the world crashing in on you, that you were like in an inescapable situation?
Well, there was a big difference there, which the others here too know. There was a movement. There was an anti-war movement, and it had come out of a civil rights movement, anti-House American activities. A lot of people have been activists against that, but then a big civil rights movement, and then a big anti-war movement, and those weren't separate, because, and even the women's liberation movement came out of that in part, overlapping in part because the women got sick of being at the anti-war movement meetings and always making all the coffee and doing the shit work of various kinds and not being called on to be real decision makers. And they started having women's meetings on that. Literally, a lot of it came out of that, out of resentment at the way they'd been treated by us, by the white male activists in that part. But anyway, you had a movement that people called it the movement. They emphasized one or another part of this that they'd come out of, but when we were finding people to give us place to stay, when they're looting the FBI for 13 days, the person who was organizing that, who was an Asian woman, who was Harvard, Janaki Chanro, her name, just had to go to almost anybody who had long hair, which in those days was as likely to be a man as a woman. And you go to a young person, in other words, and say, we have something here that might help shorten the war, and it might be very dangerous legally. Are you willing to take part? No one refused. They did it. So you had a very different situation there. That's nothing like that exists today. How could that be, by the way? And as I was listening to you, I thought of one big difference, and that is that in those days, 58,000 Americans were in the process of being killed, week by week, day by day. So everybody knew a family, knew something was involved in that. And that wasn't happening in Afghanistan because they made that a war where altogether, I think, only 2,400, well, I say only because that's the same as 9/11, but over 20 years, that many died as opposed to 58,000. And the people who were dying were Afghans or Iraqis or Sudanese, or all over the place. And the sad thing is that as Senator Goodell, who was run out of the Republican Party in 1970 for having said to end the war, he told me just before he left office, Dan, American people don't care about Vietnamese lives. And I said, Charlie, you might be right. I hope you're not right, because I think Nixon's strategy is to remove gradually American troops out of this and lower the casualties, lower the costs, and make it air war, where you are killing Vietnamese only, not Americans. Well, I think that's what he did intend to do. How long could he have kept that going? The answer is Afghanistan. 20 years. Could have been longer. How many Afghans were killed? Americans didn't ask that question. I think very few of them have ever seen an estimate of how many Afghans were killed. They don't care. Pilots, well, they're volunteers. Drones, no problem. I'm sorry to say, and I don't think it's only Americans. I think other members of empires, I don't know of a case where there has been as much resistance as there was in Vietnam, or even some of these others. But in terms of general acceptance of it, that's the human situation we're dealing in. And when you get a war like Afghanistan now, as John is involved with a torture campaign or something like that, you didn't get the support. It wasn't there.
Well, I got to tell you, I was certainly moved by, I was of draft age in 1973, but it was a standby draft. And everyone around me was against the war. And we came out of the civil rights movement. My cousin was an SDS speaker. So he had influence over me. But I look at that overall movement, you had major support there. Julian Assange right now does have very little. It's the whistleblowers. It's people in London. It's a scatter shot here and there where you see people on the street. And you would think that this guy would have major support out there. And if he did, it would make his life a lot easier and make the prosecution's life a lot tougher. And I want to talk about the prosecution in this case, because we haven't spoken about that on this show. And in particular, Gordon Kromberg and the evidence that he has acquired to come up with these Espionage Act charges, which are 17. Dan, you had 13 charges against you under the Espionage Act. And you, John, had 3, I believe.
I had 5.
Let's go to the groundwork where Kromberg gets his information, Justice Department, Colleen, and talk about this guy, Ziggy Thordarson, I believe his last name is. They're using a guy who has, it may as well be Jeffrey Dahmer that they got to be the key witness. Where do they get this? Why do they get people like that, knowing what a terrible witness they will be?
They were grasping at straws. That's the short answer. They don't have any witnesses that can actually confirm any charge of the actual Espionage Act. So they had to get this kid who's been already connected to sex abuse of 9 minors, to various frauds, all kinds of criminality, and they had to go to this lowest level to get him to make up a lie that Assange told me to do some illegal hacking. Okay, so complete lie. Now the FBI doesn't care if they can this is the only way they can support those charges against the Espionage Act. Now they probably are trying to scramble right now because they don't have a witness. Their witness has gone completely south. And when that happens, typically the judge, as Daniel Ellsberg will tell you, when you have this kind of criminality involved in a case, typically the judges dismiss the case. and of course there's the other thing with the spying on Assange in the embassy as well. I mean, this is a terrible, not only weak and thin case for the prosecution, but now it's gone completely south. So why this continues to be, why Biden does not go back to what the prevailing thought was during the Obama administration, which is that you cannot prosecute a member of the press without destroying freedom of the press for all of your mainstream press. Why he doesn't go back to that or come up with some excuse to dismiss the charges at this point, because they don't have a case. The FBI, unfortunately, and Siggy is not the first really bad criminal that the FBI has used to either entrap others. There's a case right now in the Supreme Court where the informant out in Orange County was told to spy on people in the mosque, and the people in the mosque called the FBI and said, "There's a guy trying to provoke us into violence." They actually tried to rat out the FBI's own informant. He was so bad. He was doing all kinds of terrible things, and that's going up to the Supreme Court right now. Let's hope that the Supreme Court can say the FBI is not allowed to do this. And then, of course, if you also go back in history, FBI operating organized crime murderers. This wasn't a one-year thing. They operated those top echelon organized crime murderers like Whitey Bulger and Scarpa for 2 decades. 2 decades, and the only reason it went on was because of top secrecy and only because of a curious prosecutor and judge did they finally get into the files to see what was really going on. The FBI will never reveal those things. They will never reveal, because you know what? They're only rewarded for making cases. Mm-hmm. And the case against Assange is a big reward. It's just like what organized crime was back in the 80s, or the communism during the 50s under J. Edgar Hoover. There's always a flavor of the day. And when that's the top priority, if you can make a case in that top priority, your career is golden. You will go right up to the top, just like Strzok and then others in the FBI. You'll rise right up. And so there's a lot of incentives. And as long as it's top secret, until Siggy himself outed himself and said, "No, the FBI told me to, got me to lie about this," how would anyone have ever learned? And probably it would have even gone into court this way.
May I ask a question, Randy?
Yes.
I'd like to ask Colleen. So Colleen, and I know, of course, that you're not an attorney in the UK, but if you could give us an educated guess. So here you've got this guy, Siggy, who's a convicted pedophile and a convicted embezzler and a liar, an admitted liar. You've got the CIA hiring this Spanish company to bug the Ecuadorian embassy. You've got now the leaked story that the CIA and MI6 conspired to either kidnap Julian or to murder him in the streets of Knightsbridge. Judges aren't stupid, right? That has to play a role in whatever the appeals court judges are discussing right now, or beyond that, the British Supreme Court or even the European Court of Human Rights. Does it not? Or do they just keep all of that stuff out of their heads while they debate this case?
It goes back. If facts mattered in this Orwellian world where we make our own reality, unfortunately, the judges right now, some judges, not all of them, you have to cross your fingers that, this judge at least has a couple of, conscience and some thinking points that they can go through the evidence. I mean, there's nothing there. It's overwhelming.
Yeah.
That how bad this case is. But the judges are influenced by other things and loyalty, and heaven knows, I mean, we've had our officials threatening United Nations officials to keep things secret and to do what they wanted. And the United States does use some really terrible tactics at times. And so who knows what's going to happen. But if you just cared about facts, this case would have been dismissed a long time ago because there's nothing there.
Well, let me ask you, Dan, you had the FBI director was J. Edgar Hoover. You had John Mitchell as the U.S. attorney. You were facing
Attorney General.
Attorney General. Yes, he was the Attorney General. So what kind of dirty tricks did the FBI play on you?
Actually, it wasn't so much the FBI. The Hoover, apparently in his last year before he died, wanted to leave a better legacy than he was priming up to be. And according to G. Gordon Liddy, who had been in the FBI, the White House needed its own criminals because they couldn't count on Hoover to do it without Nixon signing off on a petition, on a piece of paper. Actually, literally, we can go into this, but when they wanted to get all the kinds of surveillance that they're doing now, the Houston Plan, so-called, and a lot of crimes, provocative things and so forth. And Hoover didn't want to do it unless Nixon would sign it personally, had to draw back from it. So the White House then did hire its own ex-FBI and ex-CIA people, Howard Hunt, and then a dozen CIA assets from the Bay of Pigs, who came up with orders to, on May 3rd, 1972, to incapacitate Daniel Ellsberg totally. And when I heard that from the special prosecutor, William Merrill, I said, well, what does that mean? Kill me? And he said, the words were to incapacitate you totally. But you have to understand, he said, these guys never use the word kill. It's neutralize, terminate with extreme prejudice, various euphemisms. He thought their intent was to kill me. But the important thing here is my trial was ended because those things came out. John Dean, in particular, started, revealed that one to the prosecutor and the burglary to my former psychoanalyst. So, illegal wiretaps that I'd been overheard on, all the things that have been used against Julian. So on the basis of that, one thing after another, day after day, in the last wonderful 2 weeks of my trial, after 2 years, there, one crime after another being revealed. That was a good time. And in the end, he had essentially no choice but to dismiss the charges. People were around the country, other judges were saying, why is that trial going on? And the reason was he'd been offered to be head of the FBI, which had been his lifelong ambition, to replace J. Edgar Hoover, who had just died by that time, as head of the FBI. So they were hanging that, his life's desire, in front of him if the Ellsberg case came out all right. So the trial kept going on despite all these trumps. But in the end, it did end. Now, the point is, here we have exactly the same stuff. Discussions of kidnapping, not kidnapping me. They had me with discussions of killing him, as was true on May 3rd, or incapacity, illegal wiretapping, illegal surveillance of his lawyer meetings and his doctor's meetings. Of course, it should be thrown out by any judge. If you could count on that, you can't exactly count. But the case is there. Bush could, of course, right now, simply drop the appeal to extradite him. Just say, okay, it's over. He should drop the indictment, the first indictment of a journalist ever. Of course, he shouldn't be doing that. But this is the man, he wasn't the DOJ person back under Obama. He was the vice president. The DOJ, I think it was Holder at this point, who was a mixed record, some good stuff, some bad stuff. But Holder did not want to indict him because it's so blatantly against the First Amendment. In my case and all the others, it was a question of sources to the press. Here, Julian was in the position like the New York Times. In my case, well, that is blatantly against freedom of the press. At the same time, Bush, as vice president, was saying, this man. He was asked, "Is he a high-tech terrorist?" Yes, he's a high-tech terrorist. Now, think about that. A high-tech terrorist for publishing true information? What? But this was Vice President Bush. And the Secretary of State was saying, why don't we drone him? And when that came out, he said, well, I was joking. But other people there said, hey, it didn't seem to us as though she was joking. And could she have meant that? Well, her boss, Obama, did drone American citizens without any due process, no indictment, no nothing. Anwar al-Awlaki signed off by the president to be assassinated by a drone program. And then, for reasons that have never been explained, his 16-year-old son, trying to find him before he knew he was dead, is also killed by a drone. We've never really heard what happened there. And of course, they haven't told us another American citizen, by the way. So when Snowden was in Hong Kong, it turned out, but when they were looking for him, they didn't have him yet. I said somewhere he was in danger of his life. And somebody on the Atlantic podcast, somebody said, Ellsberg is off the wall here. You know, he's blown it. It's crazy. What are you going to do? I said, you're looking at a person, if you're looking at me, you're looking at a person who had 12 people brought up from Miami at orders of the White House to incapacitate me. So I'm not making this stuff up. And that's where we've come to as a country. We'll come back to Bush. Somebody in the right, I'm sorry, to Assange. Bush is carrying out what he did as vice president. He's still going ahead with it, unlike Obama. Of course, he should end this. But here's a very concrete thing that might offer some hope. I was just told by Sulit Dreyfus, who has written with Assange, written books, stuff, the other day, that I have to look into this. That there's going to be a summit on freedom of the press or freedom of expression. I maybe you know more about that, but she says something's coming out on that which Biden will attend, and this would be a time to say, if you're going to that summit, this would be a good time to say, don't extradite Julian Assange. And if we could get some real pressure, frankly, his prospects are not good for getting out of jail for a very long time. Even if they don't extradite him on this, our government Bush will appeal outrageously to do that. So if he's challenged with this thing coming up, that may be a time we can do something to say, okay, you're talking about freedom of the press, end this case.
Yeah, I think we should all be out there demonstrating when Biden goes to this event. And by the way, Dan,
what is the event? Do you know it? I haven't heard exactly.
I don't know what it is either, but something that he's going to. We'll find out here.
Yeah, let's find out.
I just want to mention that they unleashed because of you, the Plumber Squad. The Plumber Squad went after you, and they were organized strictly to go after you. And then, of course, they went after the Democratic headquarters.
That's, right. That's what I say is the miracle. Yeah, right.
That combination, seriously, you ended a war and ended a presidency in one fell swoop. We're going to take a quick break and come back. If you guys would like to stick around for a little bit more, can I get you to stick around? We're going to say goodbye to the folks at Progressive Radio Network. And after this musical break, we'll be right back with this superstar guest list that we have. Okay, we're back. I'm Randy Credico live on the fly with John Kiriakou, Colleen Rowley, and Daniel Ellsberg. John has to leave us here in a minute. Just John, quickly, the 3 minutes. The guy Kromberg, the Gordon Kromberg. What drives this man? Why isn't he influenced by all of the things that Colleen talked about?
You know, I hate to sound cynical, but the truth is that so many of these U.S. attorneys or assistant U.S. attorneys, especially the senior ones like Kromberg, they see great futures for themselves as partners in A-list firms, as congressional candidates, maybe as candidates for governor someday. There's always something bigger, something better on the horizon. And if they can pull a Rudy Giuliani and prosecute a big name in a big case, then the next thing they do is they announce their candidacy for Congress, or they make a call to Aiken, Gump, and Strauss and say, hey, I'm available right now at 10 times what I make with the Justice Department. So it's a selfish motivation. It's all about self-promotion, shameless self-promotion.
Yeah.
John, when you say you hate to sound cynical, I agree at 90 with Lily Tomlinson, who said in her show, no matter how cynical you try to be, you can't keep up with it. That's
All
true.
right, John, I know you got to go.
true.
John, we're going to say goodbye to you and spend a few more minutes.
Have a
with
great
Colleen.
night, everybody.
All
Thank
right.
you. And thank
All
you,
right.
Randy, for the work that you do. Great to see everybody.
All right, we'll see you, John. John Kiriakou,
Bye-bye.
one of my heroes, whistleblower. His book is coming out. It's several whistleblowers, 15 whistleblowers. And we are talking with Colleen Rowley and with Daniel Ellsberg. Colleen, let's, these concluding moments, an overall assessment, what you've been watching in the Assange case. What is it at the heart of it that is driving you crazy?
The situation is driving, I think, not only me. I heard Katie Halper, and it's like being in the Twilight Zone. Again, I go back to Karl Rove's famous thing, we can make our own reality. And after 9/11, when they saw how fear worked so well to be able to manipulate the public, and how the donations to the media, from all of these corporate sources and the war machine, and that basically all they have to do is very easy job, read the government press releases and the talking points that are given to them. This makes for a world that you can hardly believe you're living in this situation right now. So the Assange case is a victim of this. Really, Orwellian gets said a lot, but it's an empire of lies where lemmings are just being led over the cliff. And yet when the emperor's new clothes, the little boy yells out, he's naked, the crowd turns on the little boy and says, no, we support the empire, we support the emperor. And if you're watching this, and of course, having had some even personal experience in the beginning of the post 9/11 stuff, it's really disconcerting. I agree with Tomlin because, I find myself becoming so cynical that I wonder if I can get more cynical at this point. Hardly believe anything off the mainstream news. And you are hard pressed to search online for, at this point, a handful. I'll put you, Randy, in that group, a handful of voices now that I can actually feel like, okay, that person has a little bit of integrity. Unlike, the Cronkite moment where we had 60% of the American population that did trust, and Cronkite might have had his bad moments too, but there was that trust. And I don't think now I'm on Greenwald writes about this all the time. How can you trust anybody in the media who has these incentives, these very perverse incentives? So WikiLeaks was an exception to that. We somehow, some way have to get back to that kind of ability to get some truth out. And maybe it would be a good first step if we could put pressure on Biden to have this extradition request dropped. And maybe it would obviously just be the very first step, but maybe that would be a step in the right direction of getting back to a little bit of truth right now.
Right. Dan, I'm going to ask you this. If you had a chance to talk to Julian Assange at this moment, what would you say to him?
Well, I told his wife and I told Soulette, who's Dreyfus is in touch with him, tell him I love him, that we're supporting him, and that he has a lot of supporters out here. As we've been saying, he doesn't have the movement that existed in my day. I was called a traitor by the president and by the vice president, but there were a lot of people who didn't agree with that, and I had a lot of support as well. And there are people. I'm struck by how many people do turn out in the rain and cold in London, both when he was in Ecuador at embassy and now. It is striking how many people do come out. More, I think, possibly over there than over here. I'm not sure. I have been in demonstrations over here for him, but not as much. But I just wanted to know that there are people out here who do support what he stands for, and he was telling the truth about the war, with publishing what Chelsea Manning was giving him at that time. And so both of them, I think, deserve great thanks from the American people for what they
I'm going to
did.
ask you both one last question, and I'm going to go with you first, Colleen. What's the consequences, ultimate consequences, if Assange is brought to this country, is convicted, and sent to prison?
I think one of the consequences, which is end of all press freedom. I mean, it's really hanging by a string right now. And, I think you could argue that it's, with the scissors, ready to be cut, that little thin string. Freedom of the press is the censorship, government leaning on social media, everything that's going on right now. I think that for sure, if this goes any further, we will not have a First Amendment in any meaningful sense. We will not have a First Amendment. And if, as Snowden has said many, many times, Tom Drake, Snowden, and many other whistleblowers, once you lose the freedom of press, that First Amendment is, I think Thomas Jefferson, he made it first. It's the number one thing. And once you don't have any ability to dissent in a democracy, no ability to get the truth out, well, the whole country will be like the informant files. Okay, a locked skiff room that you have to have a key to go into. There will be absolutely no ability to have democracy if we lose that First Amendment, and it's hanging by a thread right now.
And you, Dan, in closing, you get the Andy Rooney moment here. What would you say the consequences of an Assange conviction?
Oh, that's very clear, because he is the first time that a president has dared to use the Espionage Act or any other act against a journalist at this point, as he is indicted. And if he were extradited in the current climate, I think his chance of being acquitted, which was possible in my day with the judge who did recognize that it was unconstitutional what was happening there. And he put off a judgment on that till the end of the trial, and then the government's criminality forestalled that. So it didn't get judged, didn't get ruled on. If he is convicted, and that is upheld, then the First Amendment will essentially be nullified as far as national security, so-called. And of course, what is this national security? I've never asked this before. Let me put it this way. Which American who's died in uniform has done so actually for the national security of this country since 1945? In which of our wars was our national security actually involved? And were they actually, I hate to say this, to the families of people who have lost men, mostly men, some women now, but I hate to say their lives were wasted in an unjust cause. They were fighting courageously, in most cases, in an unjust cause. And the only way we know that largely is from the accuracy, the honesty that has come through, along with a lot of lies and a lot of omissions from the press. So I go back to Nathan Hale. The American Revolution gave us a free First Amendment eventually, not at first, freedom of the press. England doesn't have that still. They have an Official Secrets Act. And if we lose that First Amendment, and we will have, in effect, then an Official Secrets Act, and all you will have are government handouts. And that will give us more Vietnams, more Iraqs. Obviously, the freedom of the press did not perform as it should have to keep us out of Vietnam or out of Iraq earlier. It failed on that. But we would have been in a lot longer and more without such freedom as there was. So if we lose that, the empire will do even more evil than it is doing now and has done in the past.
Well said. I want to thank both of you, and John Kiriakou, Colleen Rowley, and Daniel Ellsberg. 3 times in 3 weeks, we've had the pleasure of having you on this show. 0 times in the first 5 years, but really it was worth the wait because you have just been fabulous. Thank you for being so generous with your time, and thank both of you for the sacrifices you have made in your lifetime and for your support of Julian Assange. God knows he needs it, and he needs all he can get. I'm Randy Credico. This has been Randy Credico Live on the Fly with a special edition of Assange Countdown to Freedom. We'll see you next week. Thank you very much, both of you.
Everybody knows that the dice are loaded. Everybody rolls with their fingers crossed. Everybody knows the war is over. Everybody knows the good guys lost. Everybody knows that the fight was fixed. The poor stay poor, the rich get rich. That's how it goes. Everybody knows. Everybody knows that the boat is leaking. Everybody knows the captain lied. Everybody got this broken feeling like their father or their dog just died. Everybody talking to their pockets. Everybody wants a box of chocolates and a long stem rose. Everybody knows